Okay, welcome back to History 1301. Today we are beginning with Chapter 7, and we are going to be discussing Confederation to Constitution. Okay, so our objectives today: describe the first state constitutions written and adopted after the United States declared its independence. Then we're going to analyze the federal government as it existed under the Articles of Confederation. We'll then be moving on to describing the most significant issues that the United States had to deal with under the Articles of Confederation, and we will also explain how the Articles failed to live up to the needs of the new country. We'll then move on to understanding the need for the Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia in 1787 and describe the process of writing the Constitution. We will also identify the major provisions of the constitutions created by the Philadelphia Convention, especially concerning the separation of powers and the rights given to individual states. Lastly, we will explain the procedure established for ratification of the Constitution, describe the actions of its supporters and its opponents, and explain how and when ratification was eventually achieved. So that's what's on the menu for today. Let's go ahead and continue with our lecture. We're starting a new unit. We are coming out of the American Revolution. They have fought for independence. They have achieved it. They have a treaty. All is right with the world. Now comes the hard part, right? Governing. So let's talk about some of the things that are going on at the time, okay? The Continental Congress, right? Remember, Continental Congress, American Revolution, all of that stuff. The Continental Congress had called on the colonies to draft new constitutions in 1776. Now, what they were doing was asking the colonies to become new states whose authority rests with the will of the people. Okay, so this was all the way back in 1776. What they're trying to do here is to legitimize what they're doing, okay? All of the new state constitutions deliberately created weak executives and judicial branches, okay, due to a generational, thing of fighting against the tyranny of the British government. So they deliberately created a weak executive branch or weak government on purpose because that's what they were arguing against, wasn't it? But all of these new state constitutions did share some similarities, okay? They all had a Bill of Rights, such as freedom of the press, consent to being taxed, protections versus search warrants. They also placed specific limits on participation. So what are we talking about with participation? We're talking about voting, okay? Now, eventually they will relax limitations, but during this experimental time, it's really just property owners and those that pay taxes, right? Or anybody that is worth at least 50 pounds can vote. Okay, so there are specific limits on who gets to participate in the democratic process. Number 3, there is a separation of powers. They knew that it was wise to keep one branch or one person from being too powerful. So they are going to be experimenting with, mixed governments, okay? Presumably, the legislative branch here was supposed to be the most democratic branch and therefore the most powerful, but nevertheless, all right? So what are the outcomes here? These state constitutions were valuable for working out different types of government. Many worked out well for their citizens. But the question here is, how would the states participate in and contribute to the national body, right? So national politics. They still haven't quite figured that out. Most Americans, they came to find out, were suspicious of a large national government. And of course, they just came out of this war. They weren't comfortable with, having a strong government. And that's being reflected in those early state constitutions. Okay, so let's talk about the Articles of Confederation. Now, when it was started, the Continental Congress had basically taken action, but they did so without any clear authority. Okay, so there's no legitimate federal government during the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Okay? So the Articles of Confederation is an attempt to legitimize what they're doing, okay, which is why they urge the states or the colonies to propose new state constitutions with protections, mixed government, that sort of thing. But still, there's no legitimate federal government. And this is where the Articles of Confederation comes in. Now, the Articles of Confederation is relatively short-lived. Notice how it goes into effect 1777 all the way up to 1787. Okay, so this is our nation's first attempt at government. Okay, needless to say, it doesn't work out, but we're going to talk about the reasons why in a minute. Okay, so they're doing these things. The Continental Congress is acting on whose authority, right? And so the Articles is an attempt to legitimize what they're doing. Remember, they've declared their independence, they raised an army, they've issued currency, they borrowed money from abroad, and negotiated an alliance with France. But in November 1777, it hoped to make their government more legitimate by passing the Articles of Confederation, okay? There's lots of debate about who should have the power to levy taxes and control distribution of land. Just from the beginning, it is just, they call it the United States of America to be a firm league of friendship between 13 former colonies. And so it's almost like it's doomed from the beginning. A firm league of friendship. Not really, inspiring a lot of, strength right there. But in the beginning, the form of government is a republic. And so let's go ahead and talk about the powers and the structure of the Articles of Confederation, because ultimately there's going to be quite a problem here, okay? It's unicameral, meaning one chamber, right? Just the legislative branch, and one vote per state. So you've got 13 states. Each state has a vote, one vote, and it's just the legislature. That's it. Okay. So no matter the size, no matter how big the state is, no matter how many people live in it, each state is equally represented with one vote. Okay. Now it is also going to be in charge of, diplomatic affairs, Indian affairs, military issues, issuing money. But in addition to that, the states are what's going to have the most power. So remember, the Articles of Confederation is our attempt at a federal government, right? It's deliberately weak. Each state has one vote, okay? But the states are going to have most of the power. So they are going to have authority over taxation, over trade, over, levies and fines and things like that, which at the time seemed like a good idea. But once the revolution is over, what they're going to come to find out is that it is totally impractical and very, very inconvenient to try to, continue with that plan. So let's talk about some of its successes. So it is going to be successful at creating the Northwest Territory, right, which is first organized territory of the United States. It establishes that the government would be sovereign. It is going to be looking over the admission of new states, right, and the expansion of existing ones. It's also going to prohibit slavery north of the Ohio River Valley, which is very important because after the American Revolution, that's where we start to see like a abolitionist movement really starting to pick up a lot of support, mostly in the North. However, any kind of arrangements, with fugitive slave laws and things like that, they do have mechanisms in place to return any kind of like runaway slaves to their owners. So, we'll deal with that later. So those are just some of the successes of the Articles of Confederation, in addition to Robert Morris establishing really kind of, established the first bank of the United States in order to stabilize the economy. So that was a huge also plus, right? Especially coming out after the American Revolution, where, continental dollars are really not worth much money. But Another plus, another success of the Articles of Confederation is that it created a national citizenship, right? It gave equal rights to qualifying members. So not everybody is a citizen, right? And so we'll talk more about those debates when we get to the Constitution a little bit further down the road. Okay. And like I said, with the Northwest ordinances, huge successes there, are able to organize they're able to organize all of that land, bringing in new states as they pop up, as well as, the expansion of the ones that are already there. But with all of the successes of the Articles of Confederation, and I don't mean to say like all, but they are substantial and important ones, the weaknesses are really what's going to outweigh any of the positive things here. Now, one of the challenges with the Articles of Confederation, remember, this is the federal government, okay, not the states, is that they have no authority to raise funds. They cannot tax anybody because, remember, who does that authority rest with? It rests with the states, okay? And so they are badly in debt, because of the war. Congress cannot levy any kind of taxes. They couldn't get any credit. So, yeah. That's a problem, right? I mean, it's one of those like ironic, the ironies of, independence is like, oh, they get it. Now they understand why the British were trying to impose taxes on them, because wars are expensive. And the federal government, because by design, right, the Articles of Confederation was made deliberately weak and with zero authority to levy taxes on anybody, right? It's basically dependent on the states to hand over charity. All right. So it's a huge, huge disadvantage. It's probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, fault of it. But that's not all. Under the Articles of Confederation, in order to make any kind of changes to the law, they would need unanimous approval. That means that all 13 states have to vote either yes or no on an issue. And so that need for unanimous agreement is going to be a problem, because let's say they wanted to pass a tax, right? Like a 5% tax on imported goods in order to raise revenue. All right. So they're trying to hit two birds with one stone here. In this particular case, right, they wanted to put a 5% tax. Rhode Island doesn't like it. They didn't want it because they're going to be the ones that suffer the most economically. And so they're going to vote it down. They're going to vote no. So it would actually benefit everybody. It would benefit the entire nation. It's for the good of all of them. But because tiny Rhode Island doesn't agree with it and they voted down, guess what happens? Nothing happens. And so the bill doesn't pass. Many bills died because of this, provision under the Articles of Confederation that they need unanimous approval. And, it's part of the reason why there's going to be calls for change. People saying, we got to do something with the Articles of Confederation. We got to fix it, right? It's broken. So, nevertheless. The other major weakness with the Articles of Confederation comes with international trade. So commerce could not be managed by the federal government, right? i.e. the Articles of Confederation. There's all kinds of different currencies as well, because states are able to issue their own currency and they have their own taxes, and it is a mess. It is a complete nightmare. You've got distrust between southern states and northern ones. You got bickering and rivalries between neighbor states. And what can the federal government do about it? What can they do under the Articles of Confederation? Nothing. A big old nothing. And so you've got jealousy, you've got land cessions. The day-to-day operations here under the Articles of Confederation are just like the stuff of nightmares, okay? But there's three significant challenges that I want to talk about. The first one is managing westward expansion, okay? So what am I talking about here? Remember, you've got all of your, 13 colonies. Now they are states, right? Your originals. But we got all of this land that we got, after the American Revolution. We got to organize it. Okay, and so in order to organize these into new states, we have to get states like Virginia to give up claims to lands that are west of their borders, right? If you look here closely, you know, this is claimed by Virginia, claimed by Virginia, claimed by Virginia. I mean, like, Virginia's all into everything, right? Here, here, here. Virginia's just thinking, we're going to continue to expand all the way to California, all the way to the Pacific. They don't know the Pacific's there yet, but nevertheless, you know what I mean? And this is going to create a lot of rivalries between the other states, like little Maryland, right, who is actually landlocked. It's squeezed between Pennsylvania and Virginia. They can't expand any further, or New Jersey, or Delaware, or, you know, Rhode Island. And so there's a lot of jealousy and bickering here between the states that don't have any access to Western lands. And so the federal government is trying to get them all to agree on, you know, giving up any claims to the land west of, you know, the Appalachian Mountains. So people are continuously moving out west. They need to organize those territories, but it is a nightmare because there is so much fighting in between the states as it is. Okay, so another big problem as well is foreign relations. So again, this is all happening during the early years of the United States, right, under the Articles of Confederation. What kind of power does the Articles of Confederation have when it comes to dealing with foreign countries? In the case of the British, okay, so we won our independence, right? So, okay, good. Which means that the British should have left, right? Well, they didn't. There's a lot of English that are still sticking around here, and we can't do anything about it, right? We're trying to kick them out, right? The war is over. We won. They need to vacate. But essentially, the British are like, yeah, okay, make me. Right? You and what army? And so we don't have a standing army. Right? No army, because we have no money, because we have no way to raise taxes, right, under the Articles of Confederation. So we have no protection against the English, right, that won't vacate the Northwest Territories, against the Spanish, which are claiming lands down here, right? They're claiming also access to the Mississippi and, you know, American Georgia and Spanish Florida. And again, under the Articles of Confederation, we're trying to settle those disputes. We're trying to make a deal. But, you know, those votes are coming in from the North. The South is pissed off about that because they would suffer economically. And so what happens? Nothing. Nothing. And again, these are like the day-to-day problems, right? Because they deliberately created a government that was weak on purpose, because of the distrust of, you know, tyrannical, strong central governments of the British. But now they have these problems. I mean, another case in point here is with the pirates, right? Now, pirates, right? I mean, pirates are a real problem, right? But with no navy, the U.S. government has no way of protecting, you know, merchants up and down the coast. Why don't we have a navy? Well, because we have no money, because we can't tax anybody, because we don't have that authority. So we have no protection. And, you know, there's no way that they can protect anybody when they don't have a navy, because they don't have any way to raise taxes. You see where I'm going with this? Yeah, this is a huge problem. But it doesn't end there, because debt is also a huge, huge problem, okay? During the war, the Continental Congress and then the Articles of Confederation was basically going into debt, right? They made all of these like promissory notes, like I promise to pay you back, like an IOU, bonds, which they then cannot pay after the war is over. Okay, a bond is essentially like you lend somebody money and they promise to pay it back plus interest. Well, guess what? We have no way to pay all of that debt. Because we have no way to raise taxes, because the states have that authority, not the federal government. And so all of those promissory notes, all of that debt is not getting paid back as promised. You got, farmers that are angry because they're losing their homes. They're not getting paid what was promised either. They're threatening violence. And we still couldn't raise any money, right? The problem was not solved. The army is pissed because, they didn't get paid. They didn't get the land. Like I said, they're threatening violence. The farmers are angry as well. They're demanding that the government do something to step in and, prevent the banks from foreclosing on their homes, right? They couldn't sell their things. They're trying to flood the market here. Prices are dropped. People couldn't pay their debt. They're angry because the government's not acting because they don't have any authority, right? And these guys, when they can't pay their debt, guess what happens? They get thrown in debtor's prison, right? Debtor's jail, which is where Shay's rebellion comes in. Okay. Now, part of what's happening here with the farmers, remember, they are angry, right? They are owed a lot of money. They were made all of these promises and the government is not delivering on that. So what happens with Shay's rebellion is you got all of these farmers that are essentially petitioning the courts to stop foreclosures. A foreclosure is when the bank basically, comes knocking and they want the house back because you haven't paid. And so they're actually asking the government, the courts, to do something to stop those foreclosures, but the courts do not. The farmers are going to storm the courthouse. They're led by Daniel Shay, right, who is a former Continental Army officer, and they seize control of the federal arsenal. Things are getting pretty ugly. And now the only place that actually had what do you call it? Massachusetts actually had like a militia, right? A paid militia. They were like the only ones that had it together. They're actually going to call those troops into New England and, essentially shoot at Shays' army. 6 people are going to die. But it's going to end this protest with a valuable lesson. Okay, number one is that the issue of debt was a very, very serious one that the government had to deal with. And the Articles of Confederation was incapable of doing so. So something had to be done. And then number 2, which is probably one of the most consequential reasons or effects of Shay's rebellion. And that's the danger of mob and what true democracy looks like. It's one of the things that the Founding Fathers are going to be looking at when considering what are they going to do when fixing the Articles of Confederation, and is true democracy really a good thing? All things to consider. So, this is where the failures of the Articles of Confederation comes in. There are calls for change. Like I said, all of the reasons why they have to fix it. It is completely, broken. There's just something fundamentally wrong with it. And so at the Constitutional Convention, they're going to have a meeting, right? They are there to amend the Articles of Confederation. That means to fix it, okay? So you've got delegates from all over the United States are going to come to Philadelphia, okay? The meetings there are in secret, okay? Like they knew that the meeting was taking place, but they do this in secret. Like they keep the media out, they like draw the curtains and everything. And they do this because they want each member to be able to speak their mind freely. Remember, they're trying to come up with solutions. They've never done this before. Nobody has, right? A government by the people, for the people. Insanity, right? But they're trying to figure it out. And there's a lot of suggestions that are kind of out there and wild, like Alexander Hamilton has a few things that are like, what? But that's why they did it in secret, so that the delegates there would speak their mind freely without fear that they were going to be, accused of being closet monarchists, which does happen, but that's another story for another day. So who is there? Very, very important to establish who was at the Constitutional Convention. You've got 54 delegates plus George Washington. George Washington is going to be made the president of the convention because he's George Washington, right? Like, he's the man, right? I mean, and it also legitimizes what these guys are doing there, because when you look at who the other delegates are, they're mostly very young lawyers, right? The average age is 42. They are wealthy, they are educated, and they wanted to protect trade and promote economic and social stability. So, you could say these are the elites, right? These are mostly college educated guys. So it's like the cream of the crop. And by putting George Washington as a president of the convention, it legitimizes it, like lets the people know that George Washington wouldn't go along with something if he didn't think it was the right thing to do, right? I mean, that's the kind of prestige this guy has. And so they make him the head of it. And, basically with George Washington, you can't do wrong, right? So let's talk about some of the proposed plans. So let's talk about the proposed plans at the Constitutional Convention. Right off the bat, James Madison, whom, by the way, we know so much about what went on in the Constitutional Convention because of his personal notes. So, he is going to be known as the father of the Constitution. Please do not get James Madison confused with Thomas Jefferson, who is the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison's contribution lies with the U.S. Constitution, okay? So, from James Madison, we get what is known as the Virginia Plan. What he was essentially saying was that we needed to scrap the Articles of Confederation and come up with a new plan, one that favored the states that were bigger, that they would have vote based on the number of people that lived in it, right? So obviously, the bigger the state, the more population, the more votes that they should have. On the other hand, you have William Patterson, who did not want to scrap the Articles of Confederation. He merely wanted to fix them, right? So fix the problems with it. And he was a big proponent of keeping the states equal, right? And so he was talking about having equal representation, which is why it's known as the New Jersey Plan or the Small States Plan. So whereas James Madison was proposing that we scrap the articles altogether and start over, William Patterson was saying, nope, let's just fix it. Let's keep it equal votes for all the states, because he thought it would be unfair for the smaller states that had less people living in it, that they would be voted out because simply they would have less number of votes, okay? So as you can imagine, there's intense conversation about this. There's intense debate, and it goes on for hours and hours and hours. And it just seems like they cannot agree on whether this new document should be forged in a way that it would favor, the smaller states or the bigger states like the Virginia Plan was proposing. And so, like I said, the debate was so intense that essentially the negotiations were being threatened here. People were threatening to walk out of the Constitutional Convention. And if that happens, well, then that's it. Nothing else is going to move forward. So the first set of compromises, right, major compromises here, is known as a Great Compromise. It is brokered by several people, but Benjamin Franklin is the one that gets the credit for it. Because in essence, what the Great Compromise does is it brings a part of the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan into one. Okay, so you're already familiar with this. If you know a little bit about the way that our government is designed, you know that Congress, right, the legislative branch, has a Senate and a House of Representatives. Okay, and this is where the Great Compromise comes in, right? So Virginia Plan would have favored the bigger states, right, because it's based on population. And the New Jersey Plan would favor the smaller states because it means equal representation. But the Great Compromise brings together the best of both. And so, on one side, you have the Senate, which is appeasing to the New Jersey plan, right? Because it keeps all the states equal. They all have equal representation. So in the Senate, how many senators do we have? Two per state, right? No matter how big, no matter how small, each state has 2 senators. On the other hand, and this goes back to the Virginia plan, right? The House of Representatives is dependent on the population of that state. And so neither side can get anything done without the other side's consent or approval. In other words, a bill would have to make its way through both chambers, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, in order for it to become, approved or a law, right? They both have to work together, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. What else can I tell you about this? Well, it's important enough that we're going to end up with 2 chambers, right? 2 houses in Congress, in the legislative branch, and they're making everybody happy here. Both the side that wants a Virginia plan that's based on population and the side that wants a New Jersey plan that's based on equal representation. Okay, so the Great Compromise finally brings everybody back to the table, finally gets everybody happy again, and deliberations are able to continue, right? It's like on to the next sort of big item. And now that they've agreed, okay, so we're going to count everybody, right? Some northern states are going, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean we're going to count everybody? And southern states are going, yeah, well, if we're going to base it on population, we want to count our slaves. And some people are immediately, right? They're like, oh, no, we can't have that. How can you count slaves when under the law, slaves are not considered people? And, it's like you can't have it both ways. Either they're people or they're not. And so immediately, again, the debate gets intense. People are threatening to storm off. And so here comes the second Great Compromise. It's known as the 3/5 Compromise, which was essentially hatched out of a need to keep the states that have a large slave population happy. And, if you can keep them happy, then you continue to deliberate and you continue with the process of drafting a new constitution. And so how is it that they're going to count slaves? Well, what they essentially agree to is that 1 slave equals 3/5 of a person. Okay, so for all of its entire slave population, it's going to count for 3/5, okay, rather than like 1 to 1. Some important takeaways from this is, well, when they're starting to figure out, okay, so if we're gonna count everybody, right? If we're gonna go based on population, who should we count? Do we count just the people that can vote? Do we count all the people? Do we count women? Do we count children? Do we count slaves? And that's where, of course, the slave population or the slave states said, oh, heck yes, we want them to count for something, right? They make up a huge chunk of our population in those states. Remember that in the southern states, it could be upwards of 40-50%, right? So they want them to count for something. But that's where, the northern states are going to come in and say, well, that's not fair. And so they come up with this compromise where, in essence, they're only going to be counting for 3/5 of a person, okay? So unfortunately, slavery makes it into the U.S. Constitution in the form of the 3/5 compromise, okay? Now, to keep the non-slave faction happy, there's going to be a provision written into the Constitution that basically says that the slave trade is only going to continue for 20 more years. After that, it doesn't mean that slavery is going to be illegal. It just means that the sale, right, auctions of slaves will no longer be allowed. Okay. So in essence, what does the 3/5 compromise do? Well, it counts 3 out of 5 slaves in those states. In essence, giving those southern states a third more seats in the House, right, in Congress. And that's kind of a big deal. It gives them, more electoral votes. It gives them more representation. It gives them more voting power. And so, it's going to go ahead and continue. Okay, so now that we've talked about, the major compromises, let's talk about the features of the actual Constitution, okay? The first thing that we need to sort of get out of the way here and understand is that the convention created a government of 3 branches, okay? The executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial, right? Each branch is going to have these unique powers in order to have like a mixed government, right? So that not one branch could be more powerful than the other 2. Now, in addition to that, there is going to be a system of checks and balances in play here as well, right? And this is essentially where federalism also comes in, right? Where the state governments are also going to play a role. But let's talk about, the specific powers granted to each branch, okay? Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution deals with Congress, okay, the legislative branch. So let's talk about the powers given to Congress and make sure that you know this because I will ask you about it on the test, okay? So first of all, Congress can collect taxes and raise revenue. This is a huge deal because remember that under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't do that. The states did that, but now we're talking about the federal government. They are also going to regulate commerce, both foreign and domestic. And again, this goes back to some of the problems that they experienced under the Articles of Confederation. Number 3, Congress and only Congress can declare war, okay? Not the President of the United States, nobody else except for Congress. Now, why give Congress this power and not the President? Well, because again, Congress is the most democratic branch out of all of them because there's so many members in Congress. So this would put a lot of, responsibility on many people rather than just one person, right? Which could destroy everything with one tweet. Now, Congress also has a right to maintain an army. Now, they do this through passing bills and things like that. So they maintain the army. They are not the commander-in-chief, okay? That is the president. And we'll talk about his presidential powers in a little bit. Now, because the delegates at the Constitutional Convention couldn't possibly know what could happen 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years into the future, they went ahead and they had the presence of mind to put in the necessary and proper clause, right? It's also known as the elastic clause. But basically, they put this in there so that Congress could have the power to make any changes that were necessary or proper to pursue, that change. So what does this mean? Well, it gives Congress the flexibility, right, to be able to address these problems as long as it's something that's necessary and proper. Now, what is necessary and proper? Well, it's not very specific, right? It's kind of vague. And that's part of the plan, right? They didn't want to make this so restrictive that if something comes up, 20 years down the road, that they would have to have an actual amendment to the Constitution. They're basically putting this in there to give them that flexibility, which is why it's called the elastic clause. Unfortunately, though, it's going to bring some headaches down the road, but we'll talk about that later, right? All these contradictions. But let's talk about Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. This one deals with the president or the executive branch, right? Now, first of all, who elects the president of the United States? Not you. Not me. It's the Electoral College, right? The Electoral College vote for the president. Now, traditionally, they should reflect, right, what the American people want, and they usually do. But it's become problematic in recent years, right? Like in 2000, in 2016, right? And there's been all kinds of, noise from people saying that we should abolish the Electoral College, that it's not really a good idea, that it was put into place to protect slavery. And part of the reason why the Electoral College is in there is because the Founding Fathers didn't really trust, the regular folks to know who should be president, or to have the education or the background or the experience to know what a good president looks like, or should act like, or should be like. And the other thing, too, that I wanted to mention is Shay's rebellion, right? Like, that's one of the things that they thought about when drafting, the U.S. Constitution, is the danger of mob rule and what true democracy, how ugly, really, true democracy could be. And so the Electoral College is there because technically, since they are elected officials, it's like, well, they're representing yours and my interest, right? But it also goes back to the idea that they didn't think regular folks could make that choice themselves, right? Or they didn't trust regular people to make that choice. But what do you think? Should we continue on with the Electoral College? Should we abolish it? Maybe we'll have a discussion on that soon. Let's talk about some of the powers given to the president, okay? The president of the United States can negotiate treaties, okay? They can go ahead and go to another country, or other dignitaries can come here and they can negotiate that treaty. However, those treaties need congressional approval, right? They need to be approved by the Senate. So again, that's part of like the checks and balances there. President can negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to approve it. In addition to that, the President of the United States oversees the Army and the Navy, right? The entire military, as the Commander-in-Chief. President also gets to name diplomats with approval from the Senate. They also get to execute the laws passed in Congress. So, you know how we were talking about the New Jersey Plan, Virginia Plan, the Great Compromise, how there's two chambers in the legislative branch, the Senate and the House? Well, they both have to work together, right? If a bill originates in the House and it gets approved, it has to go to the Senate, and then the Senate votes on it. And if it's approved, then it goes to the president's desk. And there, the president has a right to sign that bill into a law or not. Okay, so the president also has a check on the legislative power, right? He can veto an act of Congress by simply not signing it. But also, what's interesting is that Congress has a check on a presidential veto, and they can override a presidential veto, but they need a 2/3 majority vote. And that's a little bit harder to do. Okay, so it's not an easy thing to do, but it is possible, and it has happened before. Okay. Article 3. Okay, this one deals with the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch. One of the things that they figured out at the Constitutional Convention is that there should be a federal system of courts, right? So at the top, you would have the Supreme Court, and then you would have, regional courts, like 13 state courts and municipal and all the way down, okay? Now, the president, right, when it comes to the Supreme Court, this is something that we're seeing right now. The president gets to appoint judges to sit on the Supreme Court. And by the way, and they need congressional approval, right? So they need both. So once the president appoints a judge and they are confirmed, right, through the process when the Senate, they get to sit on the bench, as a lifetime appointment. They will sit there, until they either pass away, like we saw with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or until they retire, okay? And there's a reason for that. There's a logic behind that. that this might not apply to like a local judge, position. When you appoint these judges for their lifetime, you free them up essentially from having to run these re-elections, which could possibly entangle them in, contributions and things like that. And so rather than having to run for re-election and having to raise funds and who knows what else, their job is simply to sit on the bench and rule to the best of their ability. Because if you think about it, right, if you have like local judges that have to run for re-election every couple of years, they have to raise money, right? And that could open them up to becoming beholden, essentially, to those campaign contributions. And so, you don't want that to happen in a Supreme Court position, because the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over all constitutional questions, okay, and federal cases. And when they make a decision, when they make a ruling, that law, right, that ruling becomes the law of the land, okay? And so this is why these Supreme Court appointments are so important, because they have the potential to have a long-lasting impact. We're talking about decades on the American people. Okay, and it's very, very hard to overturn one of their decisions once it's already made. Because think about it, even if you bring another case the following year, it's still the same judges. And so you would have to have like an overwhelming amount of evidence to overturn that decision. And it's unlikely to happen unless there's actual changes within the bench. Okay, so it has a profound impact, and this is something that, like I said, can potentially, affect the lives of all Americans, right? Now, what can anybody do about a Supreme Court decision? Well, the answer is nothing, because once they rule, that's it. Like I said, the only thing that can overturn a Supreme Court decision is another Supreme Court decision. Okay, so let's talk about Article 4 in the U.S. Constitution. This one deals with the Supremacy Clause. Basically, what this part of the Constitution states is that the Constitution is supreme over all state laws in all legal matters. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution is the law of the land, and the state constitutions basically have to fall in line with what's stipulated within. And if there's ever any kind of conflict between state laws and federal law, which is the U.S. Constitution, then the U.S. Constitution reigns supreme. Okay, pretty simple. But it can get a little bit controversial and complicated, especially with modern day issues. Now, what I mean by it can get complicated is that when it comes to federal and state powers, the Constitution forbids the states from making their own money, from levying their own customs, or infringing on the obligation of contracts. In addition to that, the states are going to maintain a very significant amount of power. But if there is anything, any kind of issue that comes up, especially right after, they hammer out the details in the Constitution up until modern day, today, if there is anything that the government has to deal with, and the question is, who should address it? Should it be the states or should it be the federal government? The U.S. Constitution is clear that if a power was not specifically given to the federal government, then it belongs to the states. So again, let's review. Can the states print their own money? No, that's a federal government power. Can the states levy taxes? No, that's the federal government's, domain, right? But anything else, anything that is not specifically prohibited to the states belongs to the states. Okay? Now, this is where, like I said, it gets complicated because if you remember in Article 1, right, in the powers given to Congress, what does it say? Anything that is necessary and proper, then Congress can go ahead and pursue that power, right? Anything that is necessary and proper. So it has flexibility, right? However, when you get to this part over here, and we're going to talk about it in the Bill of Rights, right? Any power that is not specifically given to the federal government and not denied to the states belongs to the states. So as you can see, both of these provisions are kind of contradictory to one another, right? One says that anything that is necessary and proper belongs to Congress. The other one says that anything not specifically denied to the states belongs to the states. Okay, so as you can imagine, with issues that are particularly of great controversy and intense debate, the framers basically elected to leave these items kind of vague in hopes that, they would be able to debate the issues and somehow compromise over it. And it's worked out pretty well for the most part. Now, when it comes to the relationship of the government and the governed, one of the biggest differences with the U.S. Constitution is that the federal government does have a lot more power, when it comes to ruling over individuals directly. This was a big departure from the Articles of Confederation that was deliberately weak. Most of the powers rested with the states because, those people were suspicious of strong central governments. They deliberately made the Articles of Confederation weak because remember, we had just come out of the American Revolution. We come out of that entanglement with the British, right? And so it didn't quite work out, and we know the reasons why. But this is going to be a huge thing, and as you can imagine, not everybody's going to be happy with this big change. Okay. When it comes to the federal government, it had the power of taxation, but it still needed the permission from the legislature, right? So they still need to debate it. They still need to agree democratically. It still needs to be put up to a vote, and it still needs to pass with a majority, right? In essence, giving the power to the people, which is what they wanted, right? No taxation without representation. Well, here you go. This is how it's going to work from now on. Now, once they got through with, Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4, and establishing, the three branches of government and the powers that they have and checks and balances, and the vetoes and the shared mixed government, the next step is in ratifying, right? Ratifying the U.S. Constitution. And so the delegates that are at the convention, they're essentially, really trying to convince the states to hold a special convention to vote for this new document, right? They were really hoping that the states would approve it so that it can go into effect, because remember, the articles just didn't work. There's something wrong with it, fundamentally wrong. And one of the biggest changes with the U.S. Constitution is that it doesn't require all the states to approve it, right? They needed 2/3 majority. And in this case, it means that 9 out of the 13 states needed to approve it in order for the Constitution to take effect. Remember, this is a huge departure from the Articles of Confederation, which needed all the states to agree for any changes to take place. So it avoids unanimous approval, and that way things can proceed. Okay, it's much easier, not flawless, right? It's not completely without fault, but it is more democratic and it is sort of at the heart of the issue that people are going to work together to make these compromises and, put the interests of the nation first. So, like I said, the states now have to take this new document, the U.S. Constitution. They have to vote on it. And as you can imagine, a few of the smaller states are going to ratify it right away. But some of the other states with large populations are going to oppose it right away. They don't like that, the idea that their states are going to become weaker or that they're going to be subservient to, the federal government. There's all kinds of opposition here. And what we start to see almost immediately after the Constitutional Convention is two factions are going to start to develop. On the one side, you're going to have the Federalists, which are, they are a group of supporters for the U.S. Constitution as is, right? These Federalists are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Okay. Now, what they are essentially arguing here is for federalism. Now, federalism is a philosophy of government in which the states and the nation share the responsibility of government, right? So that no group can dominate each other. And so they're really going to push for the Constitution as is. But like I said, a lot of folks don't agree with it. They don't like it. They're suspicious of it. It looks an awful lot like, a strong central government is going to abuse them, just like the British did. And so there's going to be an effort here to convince the American people that they should, agree to the U.S. Constitution as is. And so we have Federalists that are going to write what is known as the Federalist Papers, in essence here, declaring their support and really kind of arguing the case for the U.S. Constitution. Now, on the flip side of that, you have the Anti-Federalist. And so these are the guys that are going to argue that they want the federal government to be weaker, right? They want a confederation of states and more direct democracy. So they want their states to have more power than the national government. Some supporters of, the Anti-Federalist Faction are people like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, Mercy Otis Warren, and R.H. Lee. Okay, so what they're basically arguing here is that, they want more specific protections. They want it written in there. I mean, they're really kind of pushing for the delegates to go back into another convention and continue to debate these issues and continue to compromise until they get it right. But Federalists are going to say, no, we don't want to do that. It's going to take too much time. It's going to, we're never going to get out of these debates after debate after debate. We need this Constitution. We need you to approve it now. And, we will deal with, the other protections in there as soon as, the U.S. Constitution is ratified and, made legal. So like I said, there's intense debate. Massachusetts, New York, Virginia are insisting on a Bill of Rights. They want amendments to the Constitution. They want explicit protections. They want it to be written in there before they approve it. And so eventually what happens here is that they agree that, pass the U.S. Constitution, ratify it, and we promise to deal with that Bill of Rights. It'll be the first order of business. And that's essentially what happens here. On June 1788, New Hampshire is going to vote to ratify the Constitution, making it the 9th state to do so. And so they don't need to wait for the other 4 states to go ahead and approve it. The U.S. Constitution is going to be the law of the land. And now they have to hammer out the other details, right, in the Bill of Rights. So what is the Bill of Rights and what does it do? So the Bill of Rights, we tend to think of it as like a separate document. It's not. It's literally like the next page in the U.S. Constitution, right? What it does is it specifically states, what protections you have against the tyranny of the federal government, okay? And so it is absolutely necessary for the ratification process, right? Remember, this is part of the deal. You ratify the Constitution, right? Your state passes it, they vote on it, they approve it, and it becomes the law of the land. And then we will get to, the next amendments to the Constitution so that we can sort of prove to you that you can trust this new form of government. You can trust this document because the next amendments that we put in there are going to address those concerns, right? In essence, what the Bill of Rights does is it shows a direct connection to the American experience that was the American Revolution, right? And so let's talk about it for a second, okay? One of the things here as well that I want you to consider is how tricky it really is, coming out of the American Revolution, the fight for independence against England, and how the number one concern, right, becomes stabilizing the United States, stabilizing the government, stabilizing the economy, stabilizing society. And that becomes more important than really kind of like living up to the ideals of the American Revolutionary War. Okay, that is going to take like a back seat to this. And that's where replacing the Articles of Confederation essentially comes from, right? Is they need to stabilize the United States. Think of all the problems that, we saw with the Articles of Confederation. Look at everything that was wrong about it, right? So yes, they want to maintain, some sort of connection to the ideals of the Revolutionary War. But the fact of the matter remains that, those are the ideals that got them through the war. Governing is different. And once we get to the next chapter and we're talking about, George Washington's presidency and all of that, you're going to see how subverting those ideals is going to become part and parcel with stabilizing the United States economy and society and everything. Now, again, just to kind of review what we went over today, right? At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787, what took place there? What was the purpose of it? Remember, they are trying to revise the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island is not going to be in attendance, and the delegates there are mostly from, the upper class. They are the elites. They are businessmen. They are lawyers. They are the ones setting the agenda. Okay. Now, there was two plans that were proposed. The Virginia plan. Who proposed that one? Do you remember? James Madison, right? The father of the U.S. Constitution. James Madison, his Virginia plan favored the larger states, okay? Because it was based on essentially like population, okay? But what the Virginia plan is essentially arguing here is that there should be a strong national government. It's addressing headfirst the problems with the Articles of Confederation, okay? Alexander Hamilton is also going to argue for a strong central government, okay? Now, part of the Virginia plan, right, is that the supremacy of the national government is first, right? And then that the power from all of the people, in the United States are what gives this government any legitimacy, okay? Now, it did constrain democracy in the lower house as well. But this is where the compromise comes in, right? Because with the New Jersey plan, this was a small states plan. What they were hoping to do here is to keep the Articles of Confederation, not get rid of it. They wanted to fix the problems with it. They wanted also for the states to retain their power. And in order to do that, they wanted to have all the states have equal representation, right? So equal number of votes. And this would stop the bigger states from dominating the smaller ones, okay? So at the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of debates, a couple of times that the whole Constitutional Convention came to a halt. The first one, of course, was over. It was whether it was going to be the Virginia plan or the New Jersey Plan. And so the Great Compromise comes in, right? It establishes two chambers, one for the Senate, which would be equal representation, making supporters of the New Jersey Plan happy. And on the other side, you have the state legislature, which is based on population, making supporters of the Virginia Plan happy, right? So both houses have to work together to pass legislature. One of the other debates that they had to sort of hammer out here was over, how should the American president be elected? Who should choose them? And so the founding fathers decided on the Electoral College to vote for the president because, they're really kind of suspicious of true democracy, right? Mob rule, because they really didn't trust, regular people to be able to make such an important decision such as choosing the American president. When it comes to other controversial issues, like we saw, they left it pretty vague, right? They left it flexible enough to be able to address those issues down the road, but this is going to become a source of contention. Okay, on the issue of slavery, right? Very, very divisive, super contentious. Both sides are threatening to walk out when it comes to, who's going to count. If we're going to be counting population, for the House of Representatives, we want their slaves to be counted. And then you have the other side that says, well, wait a minute, they're not people, they're property. And so every time, and you're going to see this throughout the rest of the semester, every time the issue over slavery comes up, there is intense opposition, and neither side really wants to back down, okay? But almost every time that the issue over slavery comes up, the slavery faction wins. And this time is no different, right? They're threatening to walk out. They're threatening to end all talks. And so eventually what happens is they agree to compromise, right? It is dealt with as a political factor rather than a moral issue. And so in essence, what do they agree to move forward with? Well, that they're going to count 3 out of 5 slaves in the population, right? Therefore, that's why it's known as a 3/5 compromise. Now, moving forward, remember, the federal government would assume the national debt of the states, those states that incurred a debt during the American Revolutionary War. And that was a problem. Remember that, that's part of the reason why the Articles of Confederation failed, was that, they couldn't tax, they couldn't pay their debt. You have all these angry farmers, you have the angry military. And so the federal government is going to assume that debt and give the states a clean slate. Now, in terms of ratification, they do not need unanimous approval. They need 2/3. In this case, out of 13 states, they only need 9 to vote for and approve, therefore ratifying the U.S. Constitution and pretty much any major change to the Constitution moving forward, okay? But there are going to be divisions here, okay? Because not everybody's happy with the U.S. Constitution as is, which is why you have the Federalists on one side, right, who are going to argue for a strong central government, and on the other side you have the Anti-Federalists, who are much more comfortable and happy with the states retaining most of their power, and they are suspicious of strong central government, and they want explicit protected rights in the Constitution, which is why they're demanding a Bill of Rights, okay? So to summarize, right, in conclusion, everything that we've talked about today, remember we have a 3-tiered government. You have the executive branch, right, which is the president. You have the legislative, which is, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then you have the judicial, right, which has a Supreme Court at the top, and then a system of courts, going down. On the other hand, also you have Federalist support from coastal regions and business interests. And the reason why they do this is because they want to overcome opposition with support of a Bill of Rights, okay, which is what we're going to talk about next. When it comes to the Constitution, there's a big advantage here because the Constitution is going to create a national republic, okay? The Constitution became a civil religion. This is one of the most mind-blowing things for me because in a country, right, such as the United States, that doesn't have an official religion, the Constitution becomes like the end of all arguments, right? I mean, if we were in the classroom right now, I would whip out like my little pocket U.S. Constitution that I always carry with me. It is like the holiest of books when it comes to the U.S. Anything that you might have an argument against, oh, you can't do that because it's against my constitutional rights. Or, I can do this because it's my constitutional right. It is literally like a religion, right? Which is the most ironic thing about the United States, in my opinion. But really, I mean, it is that important. And so there are going to be two major issues that we're going to be talking about next. The 1781 Judiciary Act, which gives federal judges the right and the legal justification to interpret the Constitution. Not the states, okay, but only federal judges. And again, we'll talk more about this later. And then also another big issue is in 1781, the Bill of Rights is ratified, right? It protects individuals' civil liberties and secures the legitimacy of the government with the U.S. Constitution. Now, for a document, right, that had never existed before, right? I mean, these are the elites, right? These are the most highly educated people, the most invested in the success of the nation. Those men that are there, those delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they are brilliant, right? In many ways. And we're going to talk more about this in the next chapter, but they are brilliant and they are sort of pulling at things from like the Romans and the Greeks and oh my gosh, like all these great thinkers, and they're really trying to do something for the first time, truly an American experiment, like none other. And for the most part, right, we can judge the success of the U.S. Constitution based on how many times it's been amended, right? If you look it up, right, how many amendments does the U.S. Constitution have? It's really not that many, especially when you put it into perspective. Like, how many amendments does the Texas Constitution have? I mean, that one has like 400 and something. And it's just incredible. And by the way, that's just on the most recent, Texas Constitution, because Texas has gone through several, right? Because it has switched hands several times. It was a republic, and then it was a part of the Confederacy, and then, it wasn't part of the United States, whatever. But the most recent Texas Constitution has well over 400 amendments. Our U.S. Constitution, much less than that. And you might have to go and look that up. I might ask you that as a bonus question on your next test. So, on the next lecture, we will talk about the Bill of Rights. I will probably record a video for you about the signature assignment, right? What it is that you have to do. It's a pretty easy thing, but I'll record a video just for the instructions as well. And after you watch this, watch Liberty, right? Episode 6. It is going to be linked on Canvas, and it should help you to be able to answer the questions on the signature assignment. And again, you're going to hear it from, the delegates. You're going to hear from Patrick Henry. You're going to hear from Alexander Hamilton. You're going to hear it from all of those guys that were there at the Constitutional Convention in their words. And I really hope that you enjoy it, okay? So for me, that's it for today. I will be posting the lecture for the next chapter sometime next week. So be on the lookout for that one. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know. And that's going to do it for me for today, okay? Have a great day. Bye.